By the time the last dinner guests left the restaurant that evening, the city beyond the towering windows had become a sea of glowing lights stretching across Manhattan. Naomi Carter quietly untied the white apron she had worn throughout the day, folded it with the same care she gave every task, and placed it inside her canvas bag beside the financial report Victoria Sterling had mocked only a few hours earlier. The comment itself no longer echoed inside her mind. She had heard similar assumptions for most of her life. People rarely expected a black waitress to spend her free time studying investment reports, commercial real estate filings, or shareholder statements. They saw the uniform first. Everything else disappeared behind it. Naomi stepped onto the busy sidewalk where the cool evening air carried the scent of rain drifting between glass towers. Office workers hurried toward subway stations. Taxi headlights reflected across wet pavement. Somewhere above those streets stood the executive offices where tomorrow's meeting would determine the future of several floors inside the building. Naomi glanced briefly toward the illuminated skyline before walking toward a quiet residential neighborhood several blocks away. Her apartment surprised nearly everyone who visited for the first time. It was modest rather than luxurious. A small living room opened into a compact kitchen where fresh herbs rested beside the window. Bookshelves built from reclaimed wood covered one wall from floor to ceiling. Instead of expensive decorations, the shelves held annual reports, biographies of business leaders, books on urban development, economics, commercial law, architecture, and handwritten notebooks filled with years of personal observations. A framed photograph rested on the highest shelf. It showed Naomi standing beside her late grandfather outside the same building years earlier when she was still a teenager. He had taught her that ownership meant responsibility long before it meant wealth. After changing into comfortable clothes, Naomi prepared a simple bowl of vegetable soup before opening her laptop. An email from the family trust attorney waited in her inbox. The subject line read, "Board meeting confirmed." She opened the message carefully. The property management company had moved the ownership meeting to the following morning because Victoria Sterling's company wanted to finalize negotiations sooner than expected. Naomi quietly reviewed the attached agenda before placing the laptop aside. She showed no excitement. Board meetings had become part of her routine long ago, even if almost nobody inside the building knew she attended them. Her family's trust owned nearly half of the property through an investment established decades earlier by her grandparents, who had quietly purchased shares long before the neighborhood transformed into one of Manhattan's most valuable business districts. They had raised her with one simple rule: never allow money to become louder than character. That lesson explained why Naomi continued working several shifts each week inside the restaurant. She enjoyed meeting people. She believed honest work kept her connected to realities that wealth often hid. Her phone vibrated softly on the table. The message came from Harold Bennett, the elderly chairman of the property management company. "Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow." Naomi smiled before replying, "Thank you. I will be there." She closed the conversation and reached for the same financial report she had been reading during lunch. Several handwritten notes already filled the margins beside leasing projections, occupancy forecasts, and renovation budgets. She reviewed each page with quiet concentration until nearly midnight. Across the city, Victoria Sterling remained inside her executive office surrounded by architects, financial advisors, and expansion plans. She spoke confidently about securing additional space inside the building, convinced the next day's meeting would be little more than a formality. She had built an impressive business through discipline, intelligence, and relentless ambition. Success had reinforced one dangerous habit she no longer recognized. She believed appearances revealed potential. Tailored suits suggested competence. Expensive offices suggested authority. Service uniforms suggested limitation. Never once did she question those assumptions after leaving the restaurant. She certainly never imagined that while she finalized presentations and rehearsed negotiation strategies, the quiet waitress she had dismissed earlier that afternoon was reviewing the very same property documents from the perspective of someone who would help decide whether her expansion proposal moved forward at all. The first person to unlock the executive offices each morning was never the chief executive officer. It was the maintenance supervisor checking lights, elevators, and security systems before the first meeting of the day. By 7:30, receptionists arranged fresh flowers across the marble lobby, Housekeeping teams polished every glass surface until it reflected the rising sun, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the quiet hallways. Long before the city's most influential executives arrived, hundreds of invisible hands had already prepared the building for another successful business day. Victoria Sterling entered shortly after 8 o'clock wearing a tailored ivory business suit that reflected both confidence and authority. Employees greeted her with practiced professionalism as she crossed the lobby without slowing her pace. She acknowledged polite greetings with brief smiles while reviewing the morning schedule displayed on her tablet. At 9 o'clock she would present the expansion proposal. At 10:30 she expected to finalize the lease for 3 additional executive floors. By lunchtime she planned to announce the company's next stage of growth to her board of directors. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Her executive assistant, Melissa Grant, hurried beside her carrying several leather folders filled with architectural renderings, financial forecasts, and leasing documents. "The conference room is fully prepared," Melissa said. "The property management representatives confirmed attendance, and the ownership group will join at 9. Victoria nodded confidently. "Excellent. I expect this meeting to move quickly." Melissa hesitated before speaking again. One of the restaurant managers mentioned an unusual conversation yesterday involving one of the waitresses. Victoria smiled faintly without looking up from the tablet. "The young woman reading financial reports?" "Yes," Melissa answered carefully. Apparently several employees thought she seemed surprisingly knowledgeable. Victoria pressed the elevator button and waited as the polished stainless steel doors quietly opened. "Curiosity is admirable," she replied. "But reading annual reports does not prepare someone to negotiate commercial real estate." The elevator doors closed as they continued upward toward the executive floors. Melissa remained silent. She had worked beside Victoria long enough to recognize both her strengths and her weaknesses. Few people negotiated more effectively. Few people also questioned first impressions less often. Inside the executive conference room, architects arranged presentation boards while financial consultants tested projection screens displaying digital floor plans of the building. Victoria reviewed occupancy statistics with remarkable precision. Every square foot had been analyzed. Every projected revenue increase had been carefully calculated. She believed preparation defeated uncertainty, and that confidence had built one of the fastest-growing luxury retail companies in New York. Looking through the expansive windows toward the surrounding skyline, she imagined the additional office space already carrying her company's name. Success felt inevitable. Several floors below, Naomi Carter entered through the employee entrance wearing the same neatly pressed waitress uniform she had folded the night before. She greeted the security officers by name, wished the reception staff a pleasant morning, and helped another employee carry 2 heavy supply boxes into the restaurant before beginning her own shift. Nothing about her routine suggested ownership, influence, or extraordinary wealth. During a brief pause before breakfast service, the elderly restaurant manager approached quietly. "Big meeting upstairs today," he said with a gentle smile. Naomi nodded. "I know." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Most people still have no idea." Naomi smiled back. "That has never bothered me." The manager folded his hands comfortably behind his back. "Your grandfather used to say something every time he visited." Naomi's expression softened immediately. "He said the building should always recognize people by character before position." Naomi looked toward the towering ceiling above the dining room where morning light reflected across polished brass fixtures. "I hope we are still trying." A few moments later her phone vibrated gently inside her pocket. The message came from Harold Bennett, chairman of the ownership group. "We have reserved your usual seat. The meeting begins in 45 minutes. Naomi read the message once before slipping the phone back into her pocket. She picked up a silver coffee pot and continued serving breakfast exactly as she had every other morning. Upstairs, Victoria Sterling organized arguments designed to persuade the ownership group. Downstairs, the quiet waitress who had carried coffee only minutes earlier prepared to walk into the same meeting, not as an employee delivering refreshments, but as one of the people whose vote would determine the future of the entire negotiation. The executive elevator climbed quietly toward the top floors while Naomi Carter stood alone inside, her reflection appearing beside the brushed steel doors with every passing level. Only minutes earlier she had been carrying coffee through the restaurant downstairs. Now the neatly folded waitress apron rested inside her canvas bag, replaced by a simple navy business suit that attracted no unnecessary attention. She had never believed expensive clothing created credibility. She preferred arriving prepared rather than impressive. As the elevator doors opened, the familiar silence of the executive corridor greeted her. Thick carpet softened every footstep. Modern artwork lined the walls beneath warm architectural lighting. Through the towering glass windows, the Manhattan skyline stretched beneath a clear autumn morning. Harold Bennett stood waiting outside the conference room with several members of the property management company. His face brightened the moment he saw Naomi. "Good morning," he said warmly while extending his hand. "I appreciate you coming on short notice." Naomi returned the handshake with a gentle smile. "Good morning. Thank you for moving the meeting forward before the lease is finalized." Harold nodded. Several ownership matters needed immediate approval. He handed her a leather folder containing the final agenda: updated financial statements, renovation proposals, and leasing recommendations prepared for the board. "Everything is ready." Naomi accepted the folder and quietly reviewed the first few pages while they walked together toward the boardroom doors. Across the hallway, Victoria Sterling stood beside a presentation screen discussing projected expansion plans with her legal advisor and financial director. Detailed architectural renderings displayed redesigned executive offices, luxury client lounges, and additional retail space covering several floors she fully expected to lease before noon. Melissa Grant adjusted the presentation slides one final time. "The ownership group has almost everyone here," she said. Victoria smiled confidently. "Excellent. Once they review the financial projections, I do not expect many questions." Just then the conference room doors opened. Several property owners entered one after another, greeting one another with quiet professionalism, before taking their assigned seats around the polished walnut table. Victoria greeted each person courteously, recognizing many from previous negotiations. Then she noticed Harold Bennett stepping inside beside Naomi Carter. For a brief moment Victoria assumed Naomi had been asked to deliver documents before returning downstairs. Instead, Harold walked directly toward one of the reserved seats positioned beside his own at the center of the ownership table. Naomi calmly placed her leather portfolio on the polished surface before taking the seat without hesitation. Victoria frowned slightly, convinced a simple misunderstanding had occurred. She glanced toward Melissa, who looked equally confused. A few attorneys exchanged uncertain looks while whispering quietly among themselves. Victoria finally walked toward Harold with a polite but puzzled smile. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully, "I believe there has been a seating mistake." Harold looked up. "A seating mistake?" Victoria lowered her voice respectfully. "The young woman beside you works in the restaurant downstairs. She may have been directed here accidentally." Before Harold could answer, Naomi simply looked up from the agenda with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the previous day. She said nothing. Victoria continued, now addressing Naomi directly. "I believe the employee meeting rooms are located on the lower floors." Several executives nearby stopped arranging their papers and quietly listened. One attorney looked toward the conference room doors, expecting someone to escort Naomi away. The room gradually became silent. Harold Bennett slowly closed the folder in front of him before folding both hands on the polished table. He looked first toward Victoria, then toward every executive gathered around the room. Finally he spoke with the same measured calm that had guided decades of negotiations. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, "Miss Carter is exactly where she is supposed to be." The silence deepened immediately. Victoria remained standing, uncertain whether she had misunderstood what she had just heard. Harold glanced toward Naomi with a respectful smile before turning back toward the room. Since not everyone has had the opportunity to meet her formally, perhaps this is the appropriate place to begin today's meeting. Nobody reached for a chair. Nobody opened another folder. Even the quiet sound of the building's ventilation seemed to disappear beneath the unexpected silence filling the boardroom. Victoria Sterling remained standing where she was, her eyes moving from Harold Bennett to Naomi Carter, as though waiting for someone to explain what had to be a misunderstanding. Naomi did not speak. She simply rested both hands lightly on the leather portfolio before her, her calm expression unchanged from the moment she entered the room. Harold glanced around the table, recognizing the confusion shared by several executives and investors. He smiled gently before speaking again. "Allow me to introduce Miss Naomi Carter properly." His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone stating an ordinary fact rather than revealing an extraordinary truth. Miss Carter serves on behalf of the Carter Family Trust, which has remained one of the principal ownership groups of Sterling Plaza for more than 3 decades. Several heads slowly turned toward Naomi. Harold continued. "The trust currently holds slightly more than 48% of this property, through long-term ownership interests established by her grandparents." The room became completely still. One attorney quietly lowered his pen onto the polished walnut table. Melissa Grant looked down at the ownership documents resting in front of her before quickly turning several pages. Victoria blinked once, unable to hide the disbelief crossing her face. "That cannot be correct," she said softly. Harold nodded toward the legal counsel seated beside him. Without speaking, the attorney opened a bound ownership register and carefully rotated it across the table. Official filings, trust records, voting allocations, and ownership percentages filled the pages. Near the center appeared the Carter Family Trust, exactly as Harold had described. Naomi remained silent while every person around the table reviewed the documentation for themselves. Victoria slowly accepted the binder, scanning each page more carefully than the last. The signatures were authentic. The filings had been recorded years earlier. Independent audit confirmations accompanied every document. Nothing had been hidden. She had simply never thought to ask who stood behind one of the building's oldest ownership groups. Harold gently folded his hands together again. "Miss Carter rarely attends meetings in person unless significant leasing decisions require direct approval. She prefers allowing the management team to operate independently." Victoria looked up from the documents toward Naomi. "You work in the restaurant?" Naomi nodded politely. "Yes." "Why?" The question escaped before Victoria realized how personal it sounded. Naomi answered with the same quiet sincerity she had shown throughout the previous day. "Because I enjoy meeting people. Because honest work reminds me to stay grateful. And because my grandparents believed ownership should never separate someone from everyday life." Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. One property manager smiled faintly, clearly hearing an answer he had expected. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the ownership register once again. Memories from the previous afternoon returned with uncomfortable clarity. The financial report. The comments about boardrooms and dining rooms. The polite laughter from her associates. Naomi had never corrected her. She had never mentioned the trust. She had simply continued serving lunch with the same calm professionalism as every other guest. Harold looked around the room before closing the ownership binder. "If everyone is satisfied regarding attendance, I believe we may begin discussing today's leasing proposal." Yet almost no one looked toward the presentation screen anymore. Their attention remained on the woman wearing the simple navy business suit. Not because she had revealed extraordinary wealth, but because she had carried extraordinary humility without ever asking to be recognized. Victoria slowly returned to her seat, placing both hands on the polished table before taking a long, careful breath. For the first time in many years, the confidence she normally carried into every negotiation had been replaced by something unfamiliar. It was not fear. It was the uncomfortable realization that she had mistaken a uniform for a limit, a profession for an identity, and a first impression for the truth. The meeting had not truly begun yet, but already the most important lesson of the morning had nothing to do with commercial real estate, leasing agreements, or corporate expansion. It had everything to do with seeing another human being before judging the clothes they happened to be wearing. The presentation screen illuminated the front wall of the boardroom, but no one looked at it immediately. Architectural renderings, projected revenue charts, and occupancy forecasts waited silently while the atmosphere inside the room slowly settled into an unfamiliar calm. Only a few minutes earlier, every person had entered expecting an ordinary commercial negotiation. Now every assumption had shifted. Victoria Sterling carefully straightened the presentation notes resting before her, not because they needed organizing but because her thoughts did. Across the polished walnut table, Naomi Carter quietly reviewed the leasing proposal with the same careful attention she had given the financial report in the restaurant the previous afternoon. Her expression remained composed. She showed no satisfaction, no resentment, and no desire to prolong anyone's embarrassment. Harold Bennett looked around the room before speaking. "Mrs. Sterling, whenever you are ready, we would appreciate hearing your proposal." Victoria slowly stood. Normally she began important presentations with confidence and polished energy. This time she paused for a brief moment before walking toward the large display screen. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice carried less certainty than usual, but more sincerity. The first slide appeared, displaying plans to expand her company's headquarters by leasing 3 additional executive floors inside the building. She explained projected employment growth, planned renovations, increased visitor traffic, and long-term financial stability. Every figure had been researched thoroughly. Every forecast reflected months of careful preparation. Yet as she spoke, she noticed something unexpected. Naomi listened more attentively than anyone else in the room. She took occasional notes inside a leather notebook, reviewed supporting documents, and quietly compared occupancy percentages without interrupting once. There was no trace of superiority in her demeanor. She evaluated the proposal exactly as any responsible owner would. After nearly 20 minutes, Victoria finished the presentation and looked toward the ownership group. Harold smiled politely. "Thank you." Questions? Several routine discussions followed concerning construction schedules, environmental improvements, and tenant access during renovations. Naomi listened carefully until Harold finally turned toward her. "Miss Carter, do you have any observations?" Every eye shifted toward her once again. Naomi closed the notebook gently before speaking. "Only a few." Her voice remained calm and thoughtful. "Overall, the proposal is well prepared." Victoria looked up slightly surprised by the compliment. Naomi continued, "I especially appreciate the commitment to increasing employment opportunities." She paused briefly before turning one page inside the proposal. "However, I have one recommendation regarding the ground floor." She pointed toward the architectural rendering projected onto the screen. "The redesign removes nearly all seating from the public lobby to create additional retail displays." Victoria nodded. "Correct. The additional space improves customer flow." Naomi smiled politely. "It also removes one of the few comfortable places where elderly visitors, parents with young children, delivery workers, and building employees can rest during long days." The room became thoughtful rather than tense. Naomi continued, "Buildings succeed financially when people want to spend time inside them. Sometimes a chair creates more long-term value than another display case." One architect quietly nodded while reviewing the floor plans. Another property manager added, "Visitor surveys have actually mentioned the seating area several times." Victoria looked back toward the rendering. She had focused almost entirely on projected revenue. She had never considered how the redesign might affect people who simply needed a place to sit. Naomi offered another small suggestion concerning improved accessibility near the restaurant entrance, followed by a recommendation to increase natural lighting inside several shared community spaces. None of her comments criticized the proposal. Each one strengthened it. By the time she finished speaking, the discussion had transformed from negotiation into collaboration. Harold looked around the table with quiet satisfaction. "Excellent suggestions." Several ownership representatives agreed immediately. Victoria slowly closed her presentation folder before meeting Naomi's eyes across the table. Yesterday she had assumed the young waitress only admired buildings through financial reports she could never fully understand. Today the same woman had improved an expansion plan by remembering the people who actually walked through the building every day. For the second time in less than 24 hours, Naomi had quietly reminded everyone in the room that true leadership was measured not only by profits, but by the lives touched inside the spaces those profits helped create. The discussion continued long after the presentation ended, but the atmosphere inside the boardroom had changed in ways no financial projection could explain. Earlier that morning, every opinion Naomi Carter offered had been measured against the memory of a waitress carrying a silver tray. Now every person around the polished walnut table listened because of the clarity of her reasoning rather than the title beneath her name. Harold Bennett quietly reviewed the amended notes while architects adjusted several floor plans to reflect the recommendations that had just been accepted. The revised lobby design restored comfortable seating areas, expanded accessible pathways, and preserved natural gathering spaces without reducing the project's financial value. One architect smiled as he recalculated the numbers. "The operating cost barely changes," he admitted. "The experience for visitors improves considerably." Another property manager nodded. "Long-term tenant satisfaction should improve as well." Victoria Sterling listened without interrupting. She had entered the meeting believing success came from speaking first and convincing others to agree. Watching Naomi work revealed a different kind of leadership. She never argued simply to win. She asked questions, listened carefully, and offered solutions that strengthened everyone's position rather than elevating her own. The realization settled quietly inside Victoria, making yesterday's conversation in the restaurant feel even more uncomfortable. Harold looked toward the ownership group. "Are there any remaining concerns before we move to the vote?" One investor raised a hand. "Only one." He turned toward Naomi with genuine curiosity. "Miss Carter, may I ask something unrelated to the lease?" Naomi smiled politely. "Of course. You could spend every day managing investments full-time. Why continue working downstairs?" The room became still again. Even Victoria found herself waiting for the answer. Naomi folded her hands gently across the leather portfolio. Before speaking, "My grandfather believed that buildings are more than steel, glass, and contracts. They are communities. If ownership only exists inside conference rooms, eventually the people making decisions stop understanding the people living with those decisions." She glanced briefly toward the windows overlooking the streets below. "Working in the restaurant reminds me what visitors notice first, what employees experience every morning, and what small details make someone feel welcome. Those lessons never appear on financial statements." Several people quietly nodded. One facilities director smiled with unmistakable admiration. "That explains why your recommendations always focus on people before numbers." Naomi answered softly. "The numbers matter. They simply matter most when they improve someone's daily life." Victoria lowered her eyes toward the presentation folder resting in front of her. She suddenly remembered dismissing Naomi for reading investment reports during lunch, assuming curiosity belonged only to people already sitting inside executive offices. Now she understood that the woman she had underestimated had never been trying to impress anyone. She had simply been preparing herself to serve her responsibilities well, whether those responsibilities involved carrying lunch trays or protecting one of the city's most valuable properties. Harold gathered the updated documents into a single folder. "If there are no further questions, I recommend approving the proposal with today's revisions." Around the table, ownership representatives began voicing their support one after another. The decision became unanimous within minutes. Victoria watched the final vote conclude with quiet gratitude rather than celebration. The expansion her company needed would move forward, but it would become a better project because someone she had almost ignored cared enough to improve it instead of proving a point. As signatures were collected, Naomi quietly organized her notes without drawing attention to herself. She had never mentioned yesterday's remarks. She had never reminded anyone how she had been treated. She simply completed the work expected of her with calm professionalism. Watching that quiet restraint left a deeper impression on Victoria than any public criticism ever could. Respect, she realized, was not earned by winning an argument. Sometimes it was earned by refusing to let another person's misunderstanding change the kind of person you chose to remain. The final signature had barely dried before the atmosphere inside the boardroom softened into something far different from the tense uncertainty that had filled the room only an hour earlier. Leather portfolios closed one after another. Architects carefully rolled their presentation drawings into protective cases. Property managers exchanged quiet conversations about construction schedules while sunlight continued pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting across the polished walnut table where dozens of important decisions had just been made. Harold Bennett stood slowly and smiled around the room. "Thank you, everyone. I believe today's discussion demonstrated exactly why diverse perspectives strengthen responsible ownership." Several members of the ownership group nodded in agreement. One investor approached Naomi Carter with an appreciative handshake. Your suggestions improved this project in ways none of us considered. Naomi accepted the compliment with the same quiet humility that had defined every moment of the meeting. The building already had good plans, she replied gently. Sometimes good plans only need one more conversation. Nearby, Victoria Sterling quietly gathered her presentation materials without speaking. Every movement felt slower than usual, as though her thoughts remained several steps behind the meeting that had already ended. She glanced across the room and noticed Naomi helping one of the architects collect several large floor plans that had slipped from the conference table. No cameras were present. No executives were watching closely. There was nothing to gain from offering assistance, yet Naomi did it naturally, smiling as she carefully stacked each drawing to prevent the edges from bending. That simple gesture unsettled Victoria more than the ownership records ever had. The same woman she had underestimated. Only yesterday continued treating every person with equal kindness, regardless of position or title. Harold walked beside Naomi as they slowly made their way toward the conference room doors. I appreciate you adjusting your schedule for us, he said warmly. Naomi smiled. This building has always been part of my family's story. It deserves our time. Harold looked toward the hallway where employees moved quietly between offices. Your grandfather would have been proud today. Naomi's expression softened. He always reminded me that buildings should make people feel respected before they make owners feel successful. Harold nodded thoughtfully before continuing toward another meeting. Victoria remained standing beside the conference table long after most participants had left. Melissa Grant quietly approached her. Should I arrange lunch with the construction team? Victoria looked toward the hallway where Naomi had disappeared only moments earlier. In a few minutes, she answered softly. Melissa hesitated before speaking again. Mrs. Sterling? Yes. I have worked with you for 6 years. Victoria looked at her assistant. Melissa chose her words carefully. Today may have been the first time I have seen someone change your mind without trying to defeat you. Victoria gave a faint, thoughtful smile. She never tried to prove me wrong. Melissa nodded. She simply kept doing the right thing. Those words lingered in Victoria's mind after Melissa quietly left the room. She walked alone toward the same floor-to-ceiling windows where the city stretched endlessly beneath the bright afternoon sky. Thousands of people crossed sidewalks, entered office buildings, delivered packages, served meals, cleaned offices, managed businesses, and built lives that rarely appeared inside corporate reports. Yesterday she had looked at one of those people and believed she understood her entire future simply because of the uniform she wore. Today she realized how little a first impression could reveal. Behind her, the conference room had almost emptied completely. Only one leather notebook remained resting neatly on the polished table. Victoria recognized it immediately. Naomi had accidentally left it behind while helping the architect. She picked it up carefully, intending only to return it. The notebook felt surprisingly worn around the edges, filled with years of careful use, rather than expensive appearance. Victoria looked toward the open doorway leading into the quiet executive corridor. For a brief moment she considered asking an assistant to deliver it downstairs. Instead, she held the notebook gently in both hands and began walking toward the employee elevators herself, knowing that the conversation she should have had the previous afternoon could no longer wait any longer. The executive elevator descended more slowly than Victoria Sterling remembered. Perhaps it always moved at the same speed. Today every passing floor simply gave her more time to replay the previous afternoon inside the restaurant. The polished leather notebook rested carefully in her hands, its corners softened by years of daily use. She had expected the pages inside to contain ordinary meeting notes. Instead, when it had opened accidentally as she picked it up from the conference table, she caught only the briefest glimpse of neat handwritten observations about community spaces, employee well-being, accessibility, and long-term investment value. There were no reminders about luxury purchases or personal status. Every page reflected careful thought about people. Victoria closed the notebook immediately. It did not belong to her. Still, that single glimpse had quietly challenged another assumption she had carried for years. The restaurant had begun preparing for the afternoon lunch service by the time she reached the lower level. Soft music drifted through the dining room while sunlight reflected across crystal glasses and polished wood tables. Employees moved efficiently between the kitchen and the main floor, greeting guests with the same professionalism they showed every day. Victoria paused near the entrance, suddenly realizing she had never actually looked around the restaurant without focusing only on her own schedule. The elderly restaurant manager noticed her almost immediately and approached with a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sterling. May I help you?" Victoria held up the notebook gently. "I believe Miss Carter left this upstairs." The manager smiled knowingly. "She is in the courtyard checking the herb garden before service begins." Victoria looked surprised. "The herb garden? She started it last spring," the manager explained. "Fresh herbs for the kitchen. She said small improvements often make the biggest difference." Victoria thanked him quietly before walking through a glass door leading toward the courtyard. Warm afternoon light filled the small outdoor space tucked between neighboring buildings. Wooden planters overflowed with rosemary, basil, thyme, and lavender. Naomi Carter knelt beside one of the raised beds, carefully trimming a few leaves while speaking with a young kitchen employee who listened attentively. The conversation ended with both of them smiling. As the employee returned inside, Naomi looked up and noticed Victoria standing several feet away. She rose calmly and brushed a small amount of soil from her hands. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. Victoria held out the notebook. "You left this in the boardroom." Naomi accepted it with genuine appreciation. "Thank you. I did not even realize it was missing." For a moment neither woman spoke. The quiet sound of traffic echoed beyond the courtyard walls while a gentle breeze moved through the herb plants. Finally Victoria broke the silence. "I saw one page by accident." Naomi waited without concern. "You write about employees more than profits." Naomi smiled softly. "Buildings earn profits because people choose to spend time inside them." Victoria lowered her eyes. "Yesterday I believed I understood who you were after only a few minutes." Naomi answered with remarkable gentleness. "Most people make quick decisions. We all do sometimes." Victoria slowly shook her head. "No. Yesterday I did not simply make a quick decision. I made an unfair one." She looked directly at Naomi. "I judged your intelligence because you were wearing a waitress uniform. I judged your future because you are a black woman working in a restaurant. I spoke to you with less respect than you deserved, and I laughed when you answered me with kindness." The words remained suspended between them, honest and unguarded. Naomi did not interrupt. She simply listened. Victoria took one slow breath before continuing. "Nothing that happened in the boardroom embarrassed me as much as realizing you never tried to embarrass me in return. You could have. Instead, you chose professionalism." Naomi looked toward the sunlight falling across the small garden before answering quietly. "My grandfather always told me that dignity becomes strongest when someone else forgets theirs. If I had answered yesterday with anger, we both would have left carrying the same burden." Victoria felt the weight of those words settle gently rather than sharply. For the first time in many years, an apology no longer felt like a business formality. It felt like the beginning of becoming someone better than the person who had walked into the restaurant only one day before. The courtyard remained quiet long after the conversation ended. Warm afternoon sunlight rested across the wooden planters, while the gentle fragrance of rosemary and lavender drifted through the air. Victoria Sterling stood silently for another moment, watching Naomi Carter carefully return the small notebook to her canvas bag before checking the fresh herbs one final time. Nothing about Naomi's routine suggested someone who wanted recognition. She simply continued the work she believed needed to be done. That quiet consistency left a deeper impression than any dramatic confrontation ever could. "May I ask you one more question?" Victoria said softly. Naomi looked up with the same calm expression she had carried since they first met. "Of course." Victoria hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Why did you never tell anyone who you were?" Naomi smiled gently. "Because ownership is something I have. It is not who I am." The answer lingered between them. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before looking toward the restaurant where employees continued preparing for the evening guests. "Most people would have wanted everyone to know." Naomi shook her head. "My grandparents spent their entire lives teaching me that respect earned through a title disappears when the title changes. Respect earned through character stays." Victoria quietly repeated the sentence in her mind. She had spent years building a successful company, Yet she could not remember hearing a lesson that simple or that honest inside any executive seminar or leadership conference. Before leaving the courtyard, she extended her hand. Naomi accepted it warmly. There was no audience watching. No photographers waited nearby. It was simply two women choosing honesty over pride. Later that afternoon, Victoria returned to her executive office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The expansion proposal had been approved, yet she found herself thinking far less about additional office space than about the people working throughout the building below. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows she watched restaurant employees welcoming guests, maintenance teams polishing the lobby, security officers greeting visitors, and receptionists helping families find the correct offices. For the first time, she realized how many people she had passed every day without truly seeing them. She pressed the intercom on her desk. "Melissa, would you please come in?" Her assistant entered a few moments later carrying the updated leasing documents. "Everything has been finalized," Melissa said with a smile. Victoria nodded before sliding the paperwork aside. "I would like to discuss something else." Melissa waited. "How many employees work throughout this building outside the executive offices?" Melissa thought for a moment. "Including restaurant staff, maintenance, security, housekeeping, reception, engineering, and retail tenants. Probably more than 600. Victoria leaned back thoughtfully. "How many opportunities do we provide for their professional development?" Melissa hesitated. "Very few, if I am being honest." Victoria looked once more toward the busy lobby below. That should change. She reached for a legal pad and began writing ideas one beneath another. Tuition assistance, professional certifications, leadership workshops, scholarship grants, mentorship programs. Melissa quietly watched the growing list. "This is because of today's meeting, is not it?" Victoria smiled faintly. "No." She paused, before correcting herself. "It is because of someone who reminded me that potential is often wearing the wrong uniform when people choose not to look closely." Melissa nodded slowly. "I think the building would become stronger because of something like this." Victoria placed the pen beside the notepad. "So would the people inside it." Outside, the afternoon light gradually softened as another business day continued across the city. Hundreds of employees carried out ordinary responsibilities without knowing that one quiet conversation in a small herb garden had already begun changing decisions that would soon reach every floor of the building. Sometimes the greatest transformations never started inside a boardroom. Sometimes they began the moment one person finally learned to see another human being without allowing appearance, profession, or prejudice to speak first. 3 days later, the morning lobby of Sterling Plaza looked exactly as it always had. The marble floors reflected the early sunlight. Fresh flowers stood neatly arranged beside the reception desk. Security officers greeted tenants by name while restaurant employees prepared breakfast for another busy business day. Yet beneath the familiar routine, quiet changes had already begun. Small conversations replaced old assumptions. Executives who once hurried past maintenance workers now paused to say good morning. Managers who had rarely visited the restaurant found themselves thanking servers by name. No company memo had instructed anyone to behave differently. The change had spread naturally, one respectful interaction at a time. Naomi Carter noticed it without mentioning it. She arrived through the employee entrance carrying the same canvas bag that held her notebook and financial reports, tied on her navy waitress apron, and began preparing tables exactly as she had every other morning. She believed consistency mattered more than attention. A few minutes before the restaurant opened, the elderly manager approached with a thoughtful smile. "Someone is asking for you." Naomi looked toward the entrance and saw Victoria Sterling standing quietly near the window, dressed in a simple business suit. Without the group of executives who usually surrounded her. She waited patiently until Naomi finished arranging the last table before walking forward. "Good morning," Victoria said warmly. "Good morning," Naomi replied. "Do you have a few minutes before your shift begins?" Naomi nodded, and together they stepped into the same small courtyard where they had spoken only days earlier. The herb garden looked brighter after the morning rain. Tiny drops of water rested on fresh basil leaves while sunlight slowly warmed the wooden planters. Victoria held a thin leather folder in her hands. "Our board met yesterday afternoon," she began. "We approved something unanimously." She handed the folder to Naomi. Inside were detailed plans for a new employee development initiative that included tuition assistance, professional certification grants, mentoring opportunities, leadership workshops, and scholarships available to every employee working inside the building, regardless of department or position. Naomi carefully turned each page without speaking. Victoria smiled gently. We decided the program should not carry my company's name. Naomi looked up. Then whose? Victoria answered without hesitation. The Carter Opportunity Initiative. Naomi immediately shook her head. I appreciate the kindness, but I cannot accept that. Victoria seemed unsurprised. I thought you might say that. She opened another page where a blank title remained waiting. Then perhaps you should choose the name. Naomi studied the documents for another quiet moment before smiling. Call it Open Doors. Victoria looked curious. Why that? Naomi closed the folder carefully. Because opportunities should invite people in without asking where they started. For several seconds neither woman spoke. The words seemed perfectly suited to everything that had happened since their first conversation. Victoria slowly nodded. Open doors it is. She looked toward the busy building rising above the courtyard. Do you know something I realized after our meeting? Naomi waited. I spent years trying to build a successful company inside this building. Victoria smiled softly. You reminded me that the greatest investment was never the space itself. It has always been the people walking through it every day. Naomi's eyes followed several restaurant employees laughing together as they carried fresh produce through the back entrance. Buildings last because people care for them, she answered quietly. The same is true for communities. The restaurant manager called gently from the doorway that breakfast service was about to begin. Naomi thanked Victoria before returning toward the dining room. As she tied her apron once more, nothing about her appearance suggested ownership, influence, or wealth. She still welcomed every guest with the same sincere smile. The only difference was invisible. Somewhere above the restaurant, decisions had already been made that would soon give hundreds of ordinary employees the chance to write futures no one else had expected for them, simply because two women had chosen understanding over pride and respect over assumptions. 2 weeks later, the largest conference room inside Sterling Plaza looked different from any meeting Naomi Carter had attended before. Instead of financial forecasts covering the projection screens, photographs of employees from every department appeared one after another. Restaurant servers, maintenance technicians, receptionists, security officers, cleaning staff, retail associates, engineers, and office assistants smiled beside simple captions describing the careers they hoped to pursue one day. Morning sunlight filled the room through the towering glass windows, while more than 200 employees quietly found their seats. Some wore business suits. Others arrived wearing work uniforms because they would return to their shifts immediately after the presentation. For the first time, every position inside the building shared the same room with the same purpose. Victoria Sterling stood near the podium, but she did not begin speaking immediately. She looked across the audience, recognizing faces she had walked past for years without ever truly knowing. The memory made her pause. Finally she stepped forward. Thank you for being here, she said. Today is not about announcing a new business expansion. It is about investing in the people who make this building worth coming to every day. The room remained completely quiet. Victoria continued with calm sincerity. Not long ago, I believed success could be measured by titles, offices, and achievements. I have learned something much more important. Talent does not choose a uniform before it appears. Opportunity should not either. Several employees exchanged thoughtful glances while others listened with quiet attention. Victoria turned toward Naomi, who stood beside Harold Bennett near the front row rather than on the stage. I would like to thank someone whose integrity changed far more than a single meeting. Naomi gently shook her head almost immediately, hoping the attention would pass elsewhere. Victoria smiled with understanding. She would probably prefer that I say nothing about her. That is exactly why I believe I should. Soft laughter moved gently through the audience. Victoria continued. Because one person's humility reminded all of us that respect must come before recognition. She then invited Naomi to join her at the podium. After a brief hesitation, Naomi walked forward through warm applause that sounded sincere rather than ceremonial. She looked across the room at familiar faces from the restaurant, the maintenance department, the front desk, engineering, housekeeping, and security. Many had worked beside her for years. She rested both hands lightly on the podium before speaking. "I only want to say one thing." The room became still once again. Every person in this building has a story that cannot be understood by looking at a name badge or a uniform. She smiled gently toward several restaurant employees seated together near the back. "Some of you are studying before sunrise. Some are caring for parents after work. Some are saving for college. Some have dreams you have never spoken aloud because you thought no one would listen." She paused briefly before continuing. "Please do not stop believing those dreams deserve your effort. The opportunity you are waiting for may arrive quietly. When it does, be ready." Silence settled across the room before the applause returned, warmer than before. Harold Bennett stepped forward holding a simple blue folder. "On behalf of the ownership group," he announced, "I am honored to officially open the Open Doors Initiative." The audience rose together, not because anyone asked them to, but because hope had quietly become something they could finally see. As sunlight reflected across the polished floor, Naomi looked toward the employees filling the room and realized the greatest investment her grandparents had ever made was never measured in square feet or market value. It was measured in people who finally believed that tomorrow could become larger than yesterday. 6 months later, the familiar rhythm of Sterling Plaza carried a different kind of energy. Morning sunlight flowed across the marble lobby, reflecting from polished glass walls while employees greeted one another with an ease that had not existed before. The Open Doors Initiative had quietly become part of the building's identity. A security officer attended evening classes in information technology. A receptionist had begun studying accounting. 2 restaurant servers were completing hospitality management certificates. A maintenance technician had enrolled in engineering courses. None of them believed those opportunities would have existed only months earlier. Naomi Carter still arrived through the same employee entrance carrying the same canvas bag she had used for years. She still worked several restaurant shifts each week, not because she needed the income, but because she wanted to remain connected to the people whose lives had always mattered most to her. Guests continued seeing a kind waitress serving breakfast with a warm smile. Few realized she also attended ownership meetings upstairs whenever important decisions affected the future of the building. She had never asked anyone to change the way they addressed her. Character, she believed, did not become stronger because people finally recognized it. One quiet afternoon, Victoria Sterling entered the restaurant alone. There were no executives beside her, no scheduled negotiations, and no urgent business calls waiting. She selected a small table near the same window where she had first noticed Naomi reading a financial report. When Naomi approached carrying a menu, both women shared a knowing smile. "Good afternoon," Naomi said warmly. "Good afternoon," Victoria replied. "May I order the soup of the day?" Naomi nodded. "Of course." Their conversation felt natural now, free from the invisible distance that had once separated them. As Naomi returned with lunch a few minutes later, Victoria looked toward the dining room where several scholarship recipients laughed together during their break. "They seem happy," she said quietly. Naomi followed her gaze. "Hope usually looks like that." Victoria smiled. "You were right." Naomi looked back. "About what?" Victoria rested her hands gently around the warm bowl of soup before answering. "A building becomes valuable because of the people inside it." Naomi smiled softly but said nothing. She simply wished Victoria an enjoyable lunch before walking toward another table where an elderly couple had just arrived. Victoria watched quietly as Naomi welcomed them with exactly the same kindness she offered everyone else. There was no difference between how she treated investors, visitors, students, or tourists. Respect had never depended on who stood in front of her. Later that evening, as the last rays of sunlight reflected across the glass towers surrounding Sterling Plaza, Harold Bennett paused beside a newly installed bronze plaque in the lobby. Employees walked past without slowing, unaware that he smiled every time he read its simple inscription. It did not mention wealth. It did not celebrate ownership. It honored something far more enduring. The words reflected everything the building had quietly become. Respect begins the moment assumptions end. Harold looked toward the restaurant where Naomi was helping a young employee carry supplies before laughing together about something too ordinary for anyone else to notice. Nearby, Victoria stopped to hold the lobby door open for a delivery driver whose hands were full. The gesture lasted only a few seconds before everyone continued with the rest of their day. No applause followed. None was needed. Sometimes the greatest victories were almost invisible. They lived inside every day. Choices repeated often enough to change a culture. The city beyond the windows remained as busy as ever, filled with people rushing toward meetings, chasing opportunities and forming first impressions. Inside Sterling Plaza, however, one quiet lesson continued echoing long after a single conversation had ended. A uniform could describe someone's job for today. It could never measure the dignity, wisdom, or future waiting inside the person wearing it.